Good morning and welcome to all of you joining us for this online conversation on being, living, and dying. I'm Cherie Harder, the president of the Trinity Forum, and on behalf of all of us at the Forum, just want to thank you for joining us today on this Good Friday for this conversation with Lydia Dugdale. If you are new to the work of the Trinity Forum, we seek to provide a space to engage the big questions of life in the context of faith, and to offer programs and publications like this online conversation to do so, and to come to better know the author of the answers. We hope this conversation will be such an invitation and serve such a purpose. We are now at the point where we are nearing the end of Lent, a season which in itself bids us to reflect on our own mortality and our limitations. And today, on Good Friday, we also mark the day that God incarnate himself suffered and died. So while at most times hosting a conversation around the grim topics of life, death, and dying may seem unusual, certainly countercultural, perhaps not always all that hospitable, it seemed fitting for us at this time and on our 40th online conversation since the pandemic began to offer a chance for such discussion and reflection on the finitude and frailties of our own nature, the inevitability of our mortality, and the hope before us and what it means to live and to die well. And to help us do that, I'm delighted to introduce our guest today, who has literally written the book on precisely that subject. Dr. Lydia Dugdale is an internal medicine primary doctor and a medical ethicist in New York City. She serves as an associate professor of medicine and the director of the Center for Clinical Ethics at Columbia University, and previously served as the associate director of the program of biomedical ethics at Yale, where she was also the co-founding director of the program for medicine, spirituality, and religion at the Yale School of Medicine. She is also the author of The Lost Art of Dying, Reviving Forgotten Wisdom, which is a fascinating work around a mostly forgotten ethical tradition that emerged in response to the Black Plague of medieval times, called the Ars Moriendi, or the Art of Dying, which we've invited her to discuss today. Lydia, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you here. So we're just going to dive in at the very beginning. The Ars Moriendi, this is not a commonly understood or heard term or concept. So to start us off, what is the Ars Moriendi? And why did a very busy clinical physician in New York City decide to write a book about it?
Sure. So the Ars Moriendi is Latin for the art of dying, and it refers to a body of literature that developed during the aftermath of the mid-14th century bubonic plague outbreak that struck Western Europe. So think 1350s here. The plague is moving westward. It came from what is probably China today, carried via rats and fleas, and it just decimated Western Europe. Historians estimate that perhaps as many as 2/3 of the population of Western Europe succumbed to this particular outbreak of plague. Now, plague was nothing new, and going back to antiquity, we have recordings of it, but this pandemic was destructive. And when society tried to collect itself in the aftermath of the bubonic plague, one of the first cries on the part of the people, one of the first petitions, was that they be empowered to anticipate and prepare for death themselves. Now, keeping in mind the leading social authority in the 1300s and 1400s in Western Europe was the church. This is pre-Reformation, so it was sort of the Western church. And it was the priests really who were responsible for helping people prepare for death and then conducting last rites and the masses and the funeral preparations. All of that was under the authority of the priests. But the survivors of the plague said, hey, we need help here. We want to be able to do this ourselves. Not everything, but we want to be able to anticipate death and prepare for it. So For those that, I'm not a church historian, but for those of you who know the history of the church in the West, you'll know that the late 1300s was not a particularly favorable time for the church. There were 2 men and then later 3 men simultaneously claiming to be Pope. And so that meant that there was not really the infrastructure in place, if you will, to address the pastoral concerns, these very desperate needs, the petitions of the people. There was no one to address those. But when the church finally pulled itself together, resolved this leadership struggle in the early 1400s, one of its first items of business was to address this question of how to die well. And that led to the first iteration of the Ars Moriendi, or Art of Dying handbooks, which became a series of handbooks that didn't just stay within Western Christianity, but were adapted and adopted and translated by many different cultures and cultural groups, religious and non-religious, such that by the late 1800s, indeed the early 1800s, the preparation for death, even in the United States, was just a part of what it meant to be brought up well. The historian Drew Faust, who's former president of Harvard University, she's written this lovely book on the Civil War. And she says by the time of the Civil War in the United States, whether you were from the North or the South, attention to living well in order to die well was just part of life. Religious or not, this was something that people needed to attend to. So Sheree, you asked why would a doctor be interested in this? And the answer is that I have seen so many patients, my own patients included, die poorly. And what started out was, even as a trainee, as a medical student, and then in the US anyway, we go from medical school to residency. So it's kind of a junior doctor and apprentice doctor status. In those very early roles, I would witness time and time again patients who were lingering in the intensive care unit with no hope whatsoever for ever getting out of the intensive care unit. But who either by their own stated wishes or their family's wishes wanted to cling to the technology of biomedicine that would maintain their vital functions, even without giving them a hope of life, of getting out of the hospital, of cure. And that seemed problematic because while as a doctor, I'm all in favor of the goods of medicine and the goods of medical treatments, there's a way in which we can cling too fervently to them and not do our own work of preparing for death. So there's this kind of over medicalization of dying that I've experienced again and again and again in the hospital. And then that is also related to questions my patients have asked me, existential questions, you might say, these questions of human existence. Why am I here? What is this life all about? I just got this terrible diagnosis. I know I'm dying. What is the meaning of life? These sorts of questions patients have brought time and time again into my primary care clinical office. And so through opportunities to talk with them and engage them in sort of, interrogations of their own beliefs and what they read and what matters to them, I came around to combining those two, kind of the very practical, how do we use technology, along with maybe the spiritual or the existential. And that's what led to this book. So long answer.
Oh, that's great. Now, you mentioned just a few seconds ago the number of patients that you've had that have sort of lingered on indefinitely when death was certain, but they were unwilling to let go. And in a way, you start your book out that way, too. You said right at the outset that dying well requires the recovery of a sense of finitude. And in many ways, this is a fairly countercultural assertion. I'm thinking about a lot of well-known tech tycoons who've invested literally billions of dollars trying to crack or even hack the code for our aging and our mortality, or to freeze their brains so that in some way they can live on forever. So in many ways, that kind of approach is even valorized or admired, this sense of bravado, of knowing no limits. So I'm curious, why you believe that the realization of our limits is the first and necessary step to dying well.
Yeah, great question. The book that we're sort of talking about today was preceded by an academic book that is a collection of chapters where I got a group of really smart colleagues together to think through this question of what it would mean to die well. And part of that was looking at these various iterations over 500 years of the Ars Moriendi and of this body of literature, Art of Dying body of literature. And what was common to all of those iterations of these handbooks on dying well were two things, actually. This recognition, acknowledgement of human finitude, and the role of community in helping an individual prepare for death. So why do we need finitude? Because if we're going to do any work, we need to have the goal in mind, right? So any project we undertake, we need to know what the end is of that project. And so if the project is very matter-of-factly preparing well to die, then we need to at least be able to name that we will die one day. And I'll tell you, it amazes me the lengths to which we go as a society to avoid that. And so it's not just the tech tycoons, and the cryopreservation, these sort of freezing brains and freezing bodies in these super cold tanks in the hope that one day we'll have a cure. So it's not just that, but it's sort of all of the ways that we are constantly remaking ourselves as individuals. And certainly the privilege and the affluence of the West underscores this. The new look, the new wardrobe, the new car, the new, right? It's a constant remaking ourselves in a way to avoid thinking about our end, right? And so that's why if we're going to be talking very practically about how do we live well in order to die well, then we need to be able to name that we're dying well. And I'll just say, just briefly, many people are aware of the work on death and dying, I think from the 1970s, where they talk about the 5 stages of grief, and that you have to come, the last stage of grief is coming to accept death. And I think specifically for Christians, right, our theology, the Christian theology about death is one of paradox in many ways, right? Death is overcome. That is what Christians celebrate on Easter Sunday. But death still has a sting. It still is bitter. It hurts. It rips a hole in the fabric of our lives. And so we hold in tension, or those who adhere to the Christian theology hold in tension this idea that death has a sting, but also is ultimately overcome. So we need to start. So we don't need to accept death, but we need to start by acknowledging our finitude. And that's why I kind of put that as the first plank in trying to revive an art of dying.
Well, your second plank you just alluded to, and that is the embrace of community. And it seems like there is a paradox there as well, in that in many ways, suffering and death is an isolating process. Pain tends to isolate us from others. We don't want to go out. We don't have the energy to do that. Death itself is a solitary journey by its very nature. And so if the embrace of community is another vital plank in the Ars Moriendi to dying well, it means that others are going to have to surround the dying person. And I think almost all of us on this call most likely will have to care for someone who is dying before we die ourselves. So I wonder, just both philosophically, but also practically, as a doctor, how do we provide the encouragement and the relational care to bring community to someone who is dying so that they can die well?
Yeah. So I tend to imagine 3 different levels of community, especially for my patients. The first level is that most intimate group. So an exercise that I give to my patients sometimes is this. You're healthy now. That's great. I'm so glad. But let's just say you get to the point where you're dying. and you're actually dying in bed, who do you want to be surrounding you at your deathbed? And how are you investing in those relationships now? So that's sort of that most intimate ring of community, if you will. I gave a talk once and someone said to me, well, I know who I want to be at my deathbed. I just really can't stand the people. And so could I wait until, later in life to try to invest in those relationships? And of course, right, it's kind of a silly question, but think about it, right? If we invest in those relationships now, not only will they be stronger at the end of our lives, but they'll be so much richer now. And for the time that we have remaining, we'll be able to enjoy those relationships so much more. The give and take, right, of relationships. So family, whatever, close community. Sometimes people say to me, look, I'm kind of a loner. I like to be alone. There's one person, maybe two people that I would put in that category. That's great. We're not talking about the whole village. There's this wonderful book that's a review of 1,000 years of practices of dying in the West by a Frenchman, actually, Philippe Aries. I know there are people on this call from France, so I'm sure I just butchered his name, but he has a wonderful review of practices of dying. And he talks about how there was a time in the Middle Ages when if a person was dying, the village would be summoned and literally all the members of the village would parade past the deathbed. I mean, that's overkill, right? We don't want to go back to that. At the same time, identifying one or two people, investing in those relationships, absolutely critical. But then the community moves out from there, right? So some of my patients are very involved in religious communities or the senior center, or a bridge club or something like that. So there's sort of, and in that next layer out, these might not be the people you want really in your business when you're dying, but they are there to support. They'll bring meals, they'll help give rides, and some of this, our kind of safety net system in the US has helped to provide. So we have things like Meals on Wheels and different programs that will help meet the needs of older folks, particularly older folks, but also people with various kinds of impairments. And then the third level of community can often be, especially people with chronic medical diagnoses, that community of the healthcare team, which often increasingly includes not only the doctors and nurses, but also social workers and chaplains and care managers and kind of a whole team of people to help the person with this chronic or life-threatening illness to navigate living at home or getting to appointments and things like that. So there are these different levels of community that we can think of and invest in. And I think that's, again, the second most fundamental task of preparing to live well in order to die well.
So you mentioned the parade of French villagers around the person who had just died. And while we may not want to go back to a parade around the dying, you do talk about the importance of ritual, to help in dying well. And it seems like there's already a number of rituals, surrounding, certainly around healthcare and the pronunciation of death, but also around funerals and the care of the dying. But you've called for a reinvigoration of ritual. What rituals do you think we need to reinvigorate in order to encourage living and dying well?
So I have a chapter on ritual, and it is not at all exhaustive, but in that chapter, and I'll say the book is not a religious book. It is a book that is meant, I wrote for my patients in order to help a broad audience think about their finitude and anticipate death and prepare. Having said that, I have a chapter on questions of spirituality and religion, and I have a chapter on ritual, which pulls from not only secular rituals of the hospital, but also rituals from the Western religious traditions, particularly from Christianity and Judaism. And what's so fascinating about ritual is that well, for one, the work has been done. So there's often this sense that in this modern era of having to reinvent ourselves and recreate everything, that we also need to write our own funerals. meaning we have to write the whole liturgy, or we have to come up with all the, we have to sort of figure it all out on ourselves. That work has been done, and been done across religious and cultural traditions, and is rich and deep and sort of, attended to over thousands of years. So there's so much from which we can draw. But in the chapter in particular, I highlight a few things that were very provocative for me. So people often ask me, should we return to an open casket, sort of across the board, so that people are forced to kind of see death? And that's a longer conversation. It has to do with whether you embalm and how quickly you bury, all of which, embalming is a pretty American thing. It's there's so much to say about embalming. I'll leave that. But prior to getting to sort of the open casket and the visitation, what about the dead body? So within Jewish communities, there's a tradition of the Hevra Kadisha, which is groups of volunteers from within the Jewish community who agree to be trained, especially in preparing the dead body for burial, which in the Jewish tradition tends to happen within 24 hours. And it has to do, the ritual itself includes 3 different levels of washing the body. The first level of washing the body is as if the body were still alive. So they use warm water, and they only uncover the part of the body that they're washing. And what was so fascinating to me when I was learning about this ritual is called tahara, and I describe it in the book, is that the members of the Jewish community of the Hevra Kadisha would actually sing from the Hebrew book Song of Songs. They would sing the text to the body, a love song to the body as they were washing it. I mean, think about the intimacy of that, the care of attending to the body of one's own community, in anticipation of laying that body to its final rest. I mean, it's breathtaking. But, what do we do? I mean, most commonly in the US, grandma dies, and we call the undertaker, and we call the funeral home. And I'm not, listen, I've never done this with a body, but it was, for me, when I was learning about tahara, it was a challenge to me personally to think about how could we reimagine the care of a dead body, even within our own communities. What is this wisdom? What are these traditions that we've lost, these rituals that have been written down and clarified? It's there for us, right? And what does ritual do? It helps us navigate uncharted waters. So it gives us the kind of the foundation on which to stand when nothing is making sense. And of course, death does that. Death disrupts everything. So anyway, again, I'm not speaking poorly of funeral homes or funeral directors at all. Please don't misunderstand me. That is such important work. But I also am personally challenged to think about how we as communities, right, whether that's religious communities or family units, could again care for our own dying and dead. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I wanted to ask you about one of the, not just assertions, but in some ways an assumption of the book, of the connection between living well and dying well. And you've said several times in the book that to die well, one needs to live well. But one can think of certain examples, both in real life, but also in literature, where perhaps the person had a life that was full of unmet potential or compromises or corruptions, and yet had a death that seemed to be somewhat redemptive. One example of this is the character of Sidney Carton in Tale of Two Cities, who, a bit of a wasted life, but a sacrificial and very redemptive death, that, really evocative of a Christ figure. And so I guess I just wanted to get your thoughts on, is that link between living well and dying well, in your view, inviolate? Or are there ways where one can die well, even if one has been disappointed in their life?
That's such a great question, and especially on Good Friday, right? Because I mean, the story that comes to mind, I haven't read A Tale for Two Cities in so long, but the story that comes to mind for me is the thief on the cross. So, for those who don't know, Christ is crucified, which is what we remember on Good Friday, and he is hanging on a cross between two men who were criminals. And one turns to him and essentially says, you're the Son of God, and yeah, I put my allegiance with you. Here we are, we're hanging on the cross, we're dying, but you are the one in whom I put my faith and my trust. And Christ says to the thief, today you will be with me in paradise. Now, theologians, and I'm sure some on this call, have all different ways of understanding that and explaining that. But the idea is that for however corrupted this man's life was, in his dying moment, right, there is redemption. And that, I think, is really the story, the narrative that undergirds the Christian story, which is that there's always the possibility of redemption. Now, having said that, whenever we're setting out to do a task, we're setting out on a pilgrimage, and even if that pilgrimage is ultimately to die well, the more we can prepare, I think the better off we'll be. And certainly, you could say, well, the thief on the cross or this character in A Tale of Two Cities, neither one had much occasion to live a very good life, and certainly that may be true, but the possibility still remained for dying well. So it's not that it's impossible, but certainly with more preparation, it often goes better.
There's so many more questions I could ask you, but before we turn it over to questions from our viewers, one I think that has to be asked is, today is Good Friday, and we mark the day in which our hope died. But it's not the end of the story. And in 2 days, we will celebrate, we who are Christians celebrate the triumph of the God who is love over death. And we'll celebrate the fact that love won. And so just in our brief conversation, we talked about finitude and community and ritual, but it seems like we need to talk about the big Easter question. What does love have to do with it? How does love change, either inform or transform, our conception of dying well?
Yeah. So I know you told me you were going to ask me that right before this, and there are a lot of things to say about that. I'll preface it by saying, going back to the earliest iterations of the Ars Moriendi, these handbooks on the preparation for death, there were 5 virtues that were commonly espoused to help one die well. And they were in contrast to kind of 5 temptations to dying poorly, which is the way the writers of the booklets put it. But one of the virtues was the virtue of patience, as a consolation to the temptation to impatience, the sense that I just want to die and get it over with. I'm just sick of this suffering. I just want to be done with it. And the Christian scriptures talk about how love is patient, and the patience, the way that we bear our suffering, the way that we bear our infirmity, is best done in the context of community that can help bear those burdens for us, and that is all undergirded by love. The theologian Alan Verhey, who was at Duke, died a few years ago. He has written a book on the theology of the Ars Moriendi, and he talks about how this virtue of patience really is best understood as a virtue of love. So whether patience or love, certainly within the context of community, that is foundational, and paves the way toward both living and dying better.
Thanks, Lydia. So we're going to turn to questions from our viewers, and you can not only ask a question in the question section, which is in the lower center, slightly to the right but you can also like a question. And that helps us get an idea of what some of the most popular questions are. So for the next half hour, we'll hear directly from you and your questions for Lydia. So with that, we'll look just to see a few of the questions here, and I see several have already come in. Raymond Beasley asked, what are the implications of so many having to die alone during the pandemic in the light of the wisdom of the Ars Moriendi regarding the centrality of community in preparing us to die well?
Thank you for that question. So I'm in New York City, and I was taking care of COVID patients during the height of the pandemic here when it first really devastated New York City a year ago. And I have said again and again that this will go down as the greatest tragedy of the COVID pandemic, that by virtue of our policies, we forced people to die alone, cut off from community and their loved ones. Now, you could say, well, isn't the worst part of the pandemic that people died? Well, yes, people died. We expect that in pandemic, even if even if we had worked out better how to address the pandemic. But I think in terms of tragedies, it's really this policy-induced lonely dying. Sheree and I were talking yesterday about I've actually been writing about this recently, and I've been reading interview transcripts with individuals who lived in long-term care homes during the pandemic. And there is an elderly woman who lived in the same nursing facility as her elderly husband, but he was in a higher level of care. And she said at the time of the interview, I haven't seen him for 100 days. 100 days. And it just, these transcripts just break my heart. Was it important? I think initially it was. It was important to try to figure out how to thwart the disease, but goodness knows we haven't done a great job in the US at all. And we very quickly learned enough about the virus, I would say within a couple of months, to understand how it was spread and to understand that the N95 masks were quite effective. And once, we had enough masks, I really think that we should have changed the policies so that visitation in safe, socially distanced, whatever manner could have been possible. So it's a real tragedy, and I think it will go down as perhaps our greatest tragedy.
Mm-hmm. So I want to combine two questions from Jennifer Goodman and Joanna Lee. Jennifer Goodman asked, how does euthanasia affect society in dying well? And similarly, Joanna asked, how does the concept of living and dying well apply to practices like active voluntary euthanasia? And how should Christians respond to those type of practices?
Yes. So this is something I also work on extensively. I'm a medical ethicist, and this is, a core issue in medical ethics. And it's also, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide there's a movement worldwide to legalize them. I mean, just in the last few weeks, several countries have actually legalized them, expanded in Australia, et cetera, expanded in Canada, expanded in the United States. So there's a lot of momentum to give people this choice. And the logic for it is primarily twofold, right? That, it's my body, my choice. So there's this idea in which individual self-determination, or you might say individual autonomy or right over one's own body, leads to the possibility of making oneself dead when one is ready to die, right? So there's a logic there. The other, autonomy is one argument, and the other argument is suffering, that if my suffering is so great, I should be allowed to end my life. There's so much to say about this, but I will say a couple of things. Certainly within the Christian tradition, and the Jewish tradition, actually in most of the major world religions, there's a prohibition on killing. So it's easy to make, in some ways, a religious argument against it. Where it becomes a little bit more complicated is to make a non-religious argument against it. And here, I think that we all do best to consider the impact of legalization of these activities on vulnerable populations, the uneducated, the elderly, those with dementia, those with disabilities who already regularly face discrimination in the healthcare system. There's so many patients, I'm sure there are folks on this call, but so many people who live with chronic disabilities know that when they go into the hospital, doctors are constantly asking them, are you sure you want this? Don't you just kind of want to go home and die? There's this idea of doctors having a sense, and I say this as a practicing physician, of what is health, of what is a quality of life. And it often comports with our own health and quality of life. Whereas folks with all different kinds of impairments who have lived well with those know that it takes a different kind of orientation, but it's not a death sentence to have a disability of various kinds. So I think, whether religious or not, probably the strongest arguments in opposition to euthanasia, which is the direct killing. Okay, just to distinguish the two, euthanasia is typically injection of a patient in order to make that patient dead. It is done at the patient's request, typically. Nowhere in the world is it legal to euthanize a patient against his or her wishes, although it does happen. And actually, the Netherlands and Belgium both report cases of involuntary euthanasia, which defies the imagination, but they do. And then physician-assisted suicide, or it goes by a bunch of different names, but that's where a doctor or increasingly a nurse will give a prescription for a lethal drug, which the patient can then take when he or she is ready to end the life. So yeah, a really complicated issue. I think the other way, as a physician, I'm absolutely opposed, although increasingly my colleagues are in favor by the same logic of a right to self-determination and suffering. Well, I guess on the suffering piece, I'll just say very quickly, most people think of the need to, euthanize or take lethal drugs because the pain will be too great. But when we look at the data from Oregon and Washington, the two states in the United States that have the most cases and the longest history of legalization of physician-assisted suicide, pain is actually not the number one reason. It's actually it's way down the list in terms of the reason why patients are seeking lethal drugs. We actually are pretty good at managing pain. There's almost no pain we can't manage now. But about 90% of people who seek lethal drugs to end their lives in Oregon and Washington do so because of a loss of autonomy, a fear of becoming dependent, a fear of not being able to do the things that give their lives meaning. And therefore they want, the right to just exit. But I don't think this is what you want your doctors to be involved in. I suppose as a society, as a global society, if this is something that we uniformly want access to and people are going to vote for it, then I don't think you want your physician or your nurse to be the agent of death. So just a few thoughts on that.
I want to combine two questions from viewers who are asking about helping friends with different convictions prepare for death. So Jennifer Cromarty asked, how can we help members of the Christian community move from fervent prayers for healing to preparing for death and for heaven? And in contrast, Richard Reeves asked, it seems like those who struggle most are the spiritual but not religious, perhaps in some ways the worst of all worlds, all of the uncertainty but none of the ritual. Is that your experience? And if so, how can we best help that group who may be the fastest growing segment of the population?
Is the fastest growing, I think, in the US, but not in much of the world. I'm going to go to your first question first, which is a point I meant to make earlier, but there are some colleagues up at Harvard have done a study, actually a number of studies, that show that people who describe themselves as highly supported by their religious communities are much more likely to die in the intensive care unit on life extending, or you might say death delaying technology. So kind of hooked up to tubes and machines that aren't going to do any good ultimately, and to refuse hospice, right? So kind of strange that, and in their study, which was in Boston area, it was mostly Christians who were the group that described themselves as highly supported by their religious communities. But here we are, the same group of people that supposedly believes in life after death, believes in a resurrected body, a new body, right? This is the same group of people that also is refusing to give up on the machines. It's a little kooky. And so it does create some difficulty. And part of that, so they did a follow-up study, why is this? And part of that is probably a belief in miracles. They actually asked clergy people how they counsel their parishioners about end-of-life matters. And it turns out that the clergy far overestimated the benefits of particular medical interventions. And partly they just didn't have that much experience in the hospital, and they didn't really know what this technology would do. But also there was this desire on the part of the clergy not to encourage the faithful not to give up hope, right? We don't want to take hope away. So maybe this will work. Look, maybe this was a little bit better today. You know, there's like all these little, you know, the patient is dying. The patient is clearly not going to recover, but we fixate on these little markers, this one lab value, you know, all the lab values are terrible, but one is a little bit better. And we fixate on that, but really to the detriment of a patient sort of in many ways dying kind of free of the apparatus of the hospital. So it's tricky. We have a belief in miracles. Well, I should say religious people tend to have a belief in miracles. The clergy don't want to take away hope. Doctors have their own anxiety about death. Right. So it's not just because doctors deal with death all the time doesn't mean they've worked out their own existential questions. I have a colleague who has told me, you know, I don't know why you write about death. I never tell my patients that they're dying. I think, what? You know, a patient is dying. Yeah, he's received a terminal diagnosis. You're not going to tell him what that means. But she has so much, my colleague has so much of her own anxiety about death that she doesn't go there with her patients. So it's, you know, imperfect humans in an imperfect system, but that complicates things. So what can we do, right? So what can we do? And particularly for those on this call who are embedded in religious communities, you know, live within the context of religious communities. I mean, you can start many different ways, but I think a personal practice is read some funeral liturgies. You know, I mean, go like read the Catholic liturgy, go to the Book of Common Prayer. I mean, just read how have people made sense of death and funerals and burials. Think about the hymns or the songs that you would want sung at your own funeral, or the passages. Now, some of these liturgies have prescribed passages, others give a little bit more freedom. What texts speak to you, and who would you want to read those texts? Who would you want to speak? I mean, this is just kind of a personal exercise. I actually had to do this when I was in divinity school at Yale. Thanks to Yale for their support of this program today. And it was such a fantastic exercise to think about. I mean, reading the text of old hymns, of old funeral hymns, it's profound. But then this is also a project, an exercise that could be done in the context of a religious community, where, you know, I already mentioned Tahara and the actual preparing the body, but where this is something that religious leaders or lay leaders in a church context could invite the community to a Saturday morning sort of exercise of working through this type of thing. And really, this is an activity that needs to be repeated. In some ways, Lent and Good Friday is actually, it's the perfect season to address these matters as a congregation. But yeah, Shri, I didn't write down your second question. I'm sorry.
Our second question came from Richard Reeves, and he was asking about the group who call themselves spiritual but not religious,
Yeah.
who in many ways seem to have the worst of all worlds, and whether you had any thoughts about essentially trying to aid that group in their dying will.
Yeah, so, you know, most of my medical practice has been in Connecticut, and I would say it's not a particularly religious existence in New Haven, Connecticut. And then now I'm in New York City, which is probably summarized the same way. So what's fascinating is that whether people are within a religious community, or just because people are in a religious community doesn't mean they've got this stuff worked out either, right? On some level, we are all working through these questions of human existence, of why are we here? What happens when we die? What do I believe? And so on some level, the conversation, the questions that I ask as a doctor, now I will say I don't bring this up to my patients, but when patients come in to me and say, this is the bad news and I'm freaked out and I don't know what I believe, which has come up more times than you would think. Everything comes to the primary care doctor, everything. So this is definitely one of those questions. Then I feel like my role is to sort of ask questions back to them. And a lot of people who are spiritual but not religious have some sort of a deeper foundation that they may or may not have really tapped into, but it's not a far stretch to go from spiritual but not religious to religious. But again, I would just reiterate that just because people call themselves religious doesn't mean they've worked through this either.
So our next question comes from Wilba Brady, and Wilba asks, could you discuss forgiveness as a condition of dying well?
I love that. I have been criticized for being Pollyanna-ish about the possibility of reconciliation at the deathbed or at the bed of a dying individual. At the same time, as a doctor, I've seen so many occasions where families have come together, have overcome past grievances, even if it's temporary, even if it's not perfectly overcome or perfectly resolved, but there is a way in which forgiveness and reconciliation can feature to die well. There are a lot of examples of this throughout history. I'll just say briefly that the Methodists, which was an offshoot of the Church of England in the 1700s, the Methodists really fixated on dying well, and particularly the last words. It became very fashionable for a time in Methodism in the 1700s and 1800s to record what they called bibliographies of the dying. And this is not your standard obituary, which is basically a rehearsing of somebody's resume or CV and all their wonderful accomplishments. But this was really, how did they manage their dying and what was the last thing they said? And they published these in newsletters for their church and circulated them and studied them so that they would get ideas of how to die well. Now, this I think is problematic for many reasons. It puts a lot of pressure on people to get their last words right, which, right. I mean, that's it. And just because you say the right thing doesn't necessarily mean it reflects on a life well lived or on the, on certain religious or spiritual convictions, or even on reconciliation or forgiveness. At the same time, it's an interesting exercise again, to as we read about how others die, to think about what we need to change or do differently. With whom do we need to reconcile in order to die well?
So I'm going to again combine a few questions because we've had quite a few from Kathy Comp and from others on how to handle tragic, unexpected, sudden deaths, including the death of a child, and whether there are rituals or practices that help one walk through, essentially experience or grow through the death of someone who by all means shouldn't have died.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that I love the Ars Moriendi, this art of dying body of literature, is because when we keep the possibility of our finitude always before us, it makes an untimely death a little bit less shocking. It's always a tragedy. It's always a tragedy. But so as an example, I've been living in Manhattan in this tiny apartment for the last year through the pandemic. 2 kids, my spouse, and I've been taking care of COVID patients. And from the very beginning of the pandemic, I said to my children and my husband, it is highly likely that we will get to the other side of the pandemic and we won't all be alive. That's the reality of this sort of a virus. And I think probably everyone on this call knows either someone who had COVID or someone who died. I have personally lost family members, and I've personally lost patients. So we have held that. That's been a part of our conversation. And when my pre-adolescent girls are fighting, which is not infrequent, we pull them back into that narrative that actually our days are numbered. We don't know the number of our days, but why don't we turn these days rather from struggle? Let's turn them from struggle and fighting into days where we really grow as a family and enjoy these days together, and sharpen one another as iron sharpens iron. So that's what I do like about the Ars Moriendi, is it's this keeping finitude ever in focus, and even preparing. And the preparing is meant to be done over the course of a lifetime. Again, this isn't, let's just wait until we're really old and we've got nothing else to do, and then we'll sort of sort out our mortality stuff. But this is the work to do now. This is the work that I do with my children now, with my husband now, with my patients now, with a view to the end game, really.
Well, we have far more questions than we have time, and there's so many great questions, but we'll take one from Alberto Cole. And Alberto asks, how do you strike a balance between living in the joy of the resurrection while acknowledging the sad and the tragic reality of death? After all, Jesus wept when he heard of Lazarus' death before he raised him from the dead.
That's right. That's right. I actually have that. I have that in my book, that particular scene. I think that the Christian life is a life of tension, right? I mean, we're here and we are supposed to be, as in Babylon, building homes and planting gardens and investing in the good of this city. And yet this city isn't our home, right? We have the hope of Easter Sunday and we are stuck in Good Friday. And actually, more often than not, it feels like Good Friday, especially in my line of work. There's so much tension. I think this is what the book of Ecclesiastes captures very well, right? For everything, there's a season. And I guess my encouragement would be not to overlook or fast track through the weeping in the morning in order to hang out in the joy. And maybe that's the greater temptation in the West, particularly where we try to paper over tragedy. We probably need to spend a little bit more time sitting low, to use the language of the Jewish tradition of Shiva, sitting Shiva, the 7 days after death from burial, 7 days of just sitting low and mourning. We probably need to do a little bit more of that to sort of keep that balance. But I also don't know that balance, it's not like we can fill out a scorecard and have it perfectly balanced. But we do need to sort of attend to not rushing past one to get to the other.
Right. Lydia, thank you so much. In just a moment, I'm going to give you the last word. We've talked about last words, no pressure, but want to end with final thoughts from you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to everyone. I'll just say it has been a tremendous and tremendously difficult year for everyone across the globe. And there's a temptation to think that as hopefully the pandemic starts to wind down, hopefully, and the vaccines become more available, that those of us who are, make it to the other side are home free. But mortality is 100%. And if it's not pandemic, it'll be something else. And we're not a people without hope. So I encourage you to take this season to think well and think hard about dying well, and then to work backwards toward your living, to examine how you might live well today and for all of the days that remain. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Lydia. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Have a good Friday and a joyful Easter.